Hey guys, welcome back to Read Aloud with Miss Rafferty. We are reading Wayside School is Falling Down. It's such a silly story. I really hope y'all enjoy. We are starting on chapter 3 today. Alright, here we go. Chapter 3, Beebe's Baby Brother. Mrs. Jules asked Damien to pass back the homework. Beebe Gunn waited nervously. Except for art, her grades had not been very good lately. If she didn't start bringing home better grades, her parents said they wouldn't let her stay up past midnight. She did her best artwork after midnight. Damien handed Calvin his homework, then Todd, then Joy. "Where's yours?" asked Calvin. "I don't know," said Beebe. "Did you do it?" asked Calvin. "Yes, I did it," said Beebe. "I worked extra hard on it. I hope Miss Jules didn't lose it." Damien finished passing out the homework. Beebe never got hers. "Beebe, will you come here, please?" said Mrs. Jules. She pushed out of her seat, stood up, and nervously walked to Miss Jules' desk. "I did my homework, Miss Jules," she said. "Really?" "Yes, I know," said Miss Jules. She held Beebe's homework in her hand. "Phew," Beebe sighed with relief. "I was afraid you lost it." "No, I didn't lose it," said Miss Jules sternly. She showed the back of the paper to Beebe. Someone had written, "Miss Jules is as fat as a hippopotamus, and she smells like one, too." "I didn't write that," exclaimed Beebe. "I love the way you smell." Mrs. Jules smiled. "But if you didn't write it, who did?" "Ray," Beebe instantly replied. "Who's Ray?" "He's my little brother, Ray Gunn. He must have snuck into my room after I was asleep. He's always playing mean tricks on me. He knew how hard I worked on my homework." "Well, we'll show Ray," said Mrs. Jules. She gave Beebe an A+. "There, I don't think he'll try that again." "Thanks," said Beebe. "You may have a Tootsie Roll Pop, too," said Mrs. Jules. Beebe took a Tootsie Roll Pop out of the coffee can on Mrs. Jules' desk, then returned to her seat. She proudly showed Calvin her A+. The next day, Mrs. Jules asked Damien to hand back another batch of homework. "How come Damien always gets to do everything?" griped Kathy. "I'm sorry, Kathy," said Mrs. Jules. "Would you like to pass back the homework?" "No," grumped Kathy. "I'm not your slave." Damien passed out the homework. Again, Beebe didn't get hers. Mrs. Jules called her to her desk. On the back of her homework, someone had written, "Miss Jules has a head full of oatmeal, and it leaks out of her ears." "I didn't write it," said Beebe. "Ray?" asked Mrs. Jules. Beebe nodded. "Why don't you start checking the back of your homework?" suggested Mrs. Jules. "I did when I woke up," said Beebe. "He must have done it after breakfast while I was brushing my teeth. We had oatmeal for breakfast." She shook her head. "I won't brush my teeth anymore." "You have to brush your teeth," said Mrs. Jules. "My parent thinks he's such a little angel," Beebe complained. "He's always wrecking things, and then I'm always the one who gets in trouble. 'Why can't you be more like Ray?' they say. Yesterday he threw all my underwear out the window. Then my mother yelled at me for it. She wouldn't believe that her little darling son would do something like that." Mrs. Jules gave Beebe another A+ and another Tootsie Roll Pop. For Friday, everyone had to write a report and read it to the class. Beebe wrote her report about George Washington. She stood at the front of the room and read it out loud. "George Washington never told a lie. Not like Mrs. Jules. She lies all the time. That's why her nose is so big, and she snores when she sleeps, so Mr. Jules has to wear earplugs." Everyone was laughing. Beebe stopped reading. "What's so funny?" she asked. "Come here," said Mrs. Jules. Beebe shrugged, then walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. Mrs. Jules showed her what she had just read. "Did you just read that out loud?" "Did I just read that out loud?" Beebe asked. Mrs. Jules nodded. "I was just reading it," Beebe explained. "I wasn't listening." "It was Ray again, wasn't it?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Had to be," said Beebe. "Yesterday he put toothpaste in my socks. Then my mother got mad at me for making a mess and wasting toothpaste." Beebe got an A+ on her report and another Tootsie Roll Pop. After school, Mrs. Jules called Beebe's mother on the phone. "Hello, Mrs. Gunn. This is Mrs. Jules from Wayside School." "What's Beebe done now?" asked Mrs. Gunn. "Beebe hasn't done anything wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "She's a wonderful girl." Well, that's a surprise, said Mrs. Gunn. She's always causing trouble at home. I wanted to talk to you about that, said Mrs. Jules. I think you're being unfair to Bibi. I think she often gets in trouble when really Ray is to blame. Ray? Asked Mrs. Gunn. Yes, I know you think he's a perfect angel, said Mrs. Jules, but some children can be angels on the outside and devils underneath. Yes, that sounds like Bibi, said Mrs. Gunn. I'm not talking about Bibi. I'm talking about Ray. Ray? Asked Bibi's mother. Who's Ray? So apparently she didn't have a little brother named Ray. All right. Chapter 4. Homework. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about fractions and decimals. She explained that 0.5 was the same as 1/2. Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jules pretended not to see him. Oh, Mac groaned as he stretched his hand so high that it hurt. Mrs. Jules pretended not to hear him. Jenny raised her hand. Yes, Jenny, said Mrs. Jules, glad to call on anyone besides Mac. Mac has his hand raised, said Jenny. Thank you, Jenny, muttered Miss Jules. Yes, Mac, what is it? I couldn't find one of my socks this morning, said Mac. Man, I looked everywhere. In my closet, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, but I just couldn't find it. I asked my mother, but she hadn't seen it either. That's very interesting, Mac, said Mrs. Jules, patiently. But what does that have to do with decimals? Because, said Mac, I could only find half of my socks. Oh, right, said Miss Jules. Does anybody else have any questions about decimals? Yes, John. Did you look under your bed? Asked John. That was one of the first places I looked, said Mac, but it wasn't there. Did you check the dirty clothes? Asked Ron. Maybe it was never washed. I checked, said Mac. Do you have a dog? Asked Bibi. Maybe your dog took it. No, my dog doesn't wear socks, said Mac. Why didn't you just put on a different sock? Asked Allison, even if it didn't match. I thought of that, said Mac. See, but then if I wore a sock that didn't match, I'd be left with only one sock of that color for tomorrow. And then if I wore that sock, I'd have to wear a sock that didn't match with it. And so on for the rest of my life. I would never wear matching socks again. Well, be that as it may, said Miss Jules, we really need to get back to decimals. Yes, Stephen? Once I had both my socks on, said Stephen, but I wasn't wearing my shoes. My mom had just waxed the floor, too. Sorry, my dogs are playing in the background. Hey, girls, hey. My mom had just waxed the floor, too. I slid all around on it like I was skating. It was a lot of fun until I fell against the kitchen table and broke 2 dishes. Then I got in trouble. What's that got to do with my socks? Mac asked impatiently. Stephen shrugged. Did you ever find your other sock? Asked Leslie. Yep, said Mac, but you'll never guess where. In the refrigerator. He held out his arms in bewilderment. How did it get there? No one knew. See, here it is, said Mac. He climbed on top of his desk so everyone could see his feet. He pointed to his left foot and said, This is the sock I had from the beginning. He pointed to his right foot and said, And this is the sock I couldn't find. His socks were red with gold lightning bolts down the side. Oh, hot socks, said Mauricia. No, it was cold after being in the refrigerator, said Mac, still standing on the top of his desk. I made up a song, too, while I was looking for it. You want to hear it? He sang, I got one sock, looking for the other one sock, looking for its brother. When I find that sock, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put it on my foot, and I'll stick it in my shoe. The bell rang for recess. Since we didn't finish the arithmetic lesson, said Miss Jules, you'll have to do the rest of it for homework. All the kids groaned as they headed outside. After recess was science. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about dinosaurs. She told the class that there were 2 types of dinosaurs, those that ate meat and those that ate only vegetables. You mean like broccoli? Asked Rondi. I don't think they had broccoli back then, said Mrs. Jules. Just as there were different kinds of animals back then, there were also different kinds of vegetables. Mac raised his hand. Mrs. Jules pretended not to see him. Oh, Mac groaned. He looked like he was going to explode. Mrs. Jules pretended not to hear him. She called on Myron. Mac has his hand raised, said Myron. Thank you, Myron, muttered Miss Jules. Yes, Mac? My uncle grew the biggest watermelon you ever saw in your whole life. Man, it was huge. It was so heavy I couldn't even lift it. Mac, what does that have to do with dinosaurs? Asked Mrs. Jules. Because that must have been the kind of watermelon the dinosaurs ate, said Mac. Did you eat it? Asked DJ. Not all of it, said Mac, shaking his head. Phew, it was too big for me, and I love watermelon. What did it taste like? Asked Mauricia. Delicious, said Mac, but lots of seeds. You shouldn't eat the seeds, otherwise a watermelon might grow inside your stomach. Once I heard about a lady who was so fat that everyone thought she was going to have a baby, but she didn't have a baby, she had a watermelon. Was it a boy or a girl? Asked Joy. Everyone laughed. Mrs. Jules never finished her lesson about dinosaurs, so she had to assign it for homework. After school, Mac walked home with his girlfriend, Nancy. Nancy's class was on the 23rd floor of Wayside. Mac carried his arithmetic book, his science book, his reading book, his language book, and his spelling book. Nancy didn't have any books. I'll carry your books for you, Mac, she offered. Mac gave Nancy his books. Don't you have any homework? He asked. She shook her head. Man, it's unfair, said Mac. Mrs. Jules assigns more homework than any other teacher in Wayside School. All right, that's all we're going to read for today. I hope y'all enjoyed listening and look forward to reading on Monday. I'll talk to y'all then. I miss you. I love you. I hope y'all are doing well.